Lacy Capelle stood before the crumbling gates of the Sheridan Manor, looking like an ant against the grandness of the house. She wrapped her coat tight around her body with her trembling and rigid hands. One of those very hands clutched the thin slip of paper that read a heartfelt goodbye from her dearest Anton, and the other inched towards the rusty gate doors. Just beyond the gate stood the manor, alone on the moor, aside from a train track. It stood deserted and high, with peeling paint and windows shut from years of disuse, the tips of the manor covered by the thick fog. Not a single person ever set foot on the moor, let alone come close to the gates of the Sheridan Manor, not after the word of the deaths reached the townsfolk. Lacy slowly pushed the gate open, roughly taking in a breath as she heard its loud creak. She wiped the dust off on her coat and stepped inside the compound. Dead weeds sprouted from the ground, brushing against her legs, and the naked trees stretched their gnarly branches out as if they were grabbing at the hazy air. Pair that with the dense fog, and it was enough to make the burliest man tremble. Lacy looked around and sped up. It was 'cause of the eerie feel that she decided that she'd rather be inside. Yet, as she neared those damn decrepit peeling doors that were hanging off of 2 hinges, she began doubting whether this was something she wanted to do. It was all to prove whether she was brave enough, since the lads in her town made a mockery of her. They'd said Anton liked his women fiercer, not fiercer than him, but perhaps strong enough to hold off an intruder, while Anton went and grabbed weapons. At this, Lacy had said women weren't supposed to be strong, and that everyone knew men were supposed to be the fearless protectors. They had responded, "That's true. But Anton is different." And those very words were the reason Lacy stood, eyes wide and body shaking, creaking the doors of the Sheridan Manor open. She gently shut it, careful not to make the slightest noise, and turned back around, still gripping Anton's letter for her life. It was dark inside, but she decided against using her flashlight just yet. She was standing in the foyer, a space with only a lone red chair that leaned crooked against the wall. Something putrid filled the air, and she wrinkled her nose, trying not to gag. She walked deeper into the manor, entering the kitchen that had counters with layers of dust as thick as her finger and scurrying mice, and then entering the living room. A wooden table rested in the middle of the room, and 2 peeling love seats were placed against the bookshelves. Staring at the couches, she couldn't help thinking of Anton. He'd pleaded with her, got down on his knees with his hands clasped in front of his men. Lacy, with tears filling her eyes, had apologized and told him that she had a purpose to serve. They quarreled about it, but Lacy had stood her ground, even after being reminded that several women had died around the manor. But one specific woman, and apparently most recent, had fallen on the tracks just as a train was coming. Ethel Wallace. A light thud sounded from behind Lacy. She gasped and swiveled around. Nothing. She reached into her satchel and fumbled around inside until she found her flashlight. She quickly turned it on and shone it around the room, again being met with only silence and the beetles running in between her legs, trying to crawl up them. She whispered a prayer and turned away from the lovesight and towards the winding staircase. She was here to find a brush. They'd said, if Lacy was really going, that she needed to find a brush marked with a star and bring it back to them. A few of them said that when the manor was in pleasant shape, their forefathers inked the handle of a white brush with a star. They never mentioned the location, sending a skeptical Lacy off to a place with scarce information. She lifted the end of her dress with one hand as she slowly climbed the staircase and held the flashlight with the other. As she moved higher up, the chillier it got, her slender arms underneath her coat becoming prickled with gooseflesh. She tried to keep her heavy breathing at bay and continued forward. The light shone on a few portraits of women lining the wall, and a blank one that perhaps didn't get to be filled yet, light leading the way. Lacy's eyes widened as she stared at the women, an eerie feeling swimming around in her gut. It was only her fearful brain playing tricks on her. She hurried up the remaining steps. A dim hallway was what she entered when she set foot on the second story. Rooms lined this corridor, and Lacy felt her feverishly beating heart drop down to her knees when she knew she'd have to open them and search for the brush. She inhaled and walked onward, lowering her flashlight. The windows ahead were boarded up, but allowed a few small streams of light, though outside was still foggy and gray. Lacy opened the first door, grimacing as it gave a loud creak. She picked up her flashlight again and shone it around the room. It was small and full of boxes. She scurried over to them and crouched down, back pressed against the wall, so that she could see if anything crossed in front of the door. Not that it would happen. Say, was it even a sure thing that this place wasn't just old and broken? Were the stories about the Sheridan Manor not mere superstitions? Lacy scoured the boxes, glancing at the doorway for any sign of all things strange. And there were none. A bit discouraged at not coming across the brush, she lifted her dress and stood up, quietly walking out of her current room and entering the next one. It was a bedroom, and one not too shabby, Lacy noticed. A poster bed and 2 velvet couches sat there. Lacy went and settled down on one couch, her mind now focusing on her grumbling stomach. Nervously, she pulled out a loaf of bread she'd packed in her coat pocket and took a small bite, maintaining ladylike manners even in a place like this. Lacy's heart ached at the thought of Anton. He was a good man, and their courtship was well approved of from both parties. She wondered how his parents would react, knowing she went off in search for a brush to prove young men wrong and further impress their son. Lacy opened her eyes and thought she saw a figure pass in front of the doorway. She screamed and slapped her hand over her mouth. Standing up, she fingered the dagger Anton had slipped to her before her journey. She walked towards the door and looked around her. Her eyes only fell upon a quiet and empty hallway. Stepping back inside the room, she gently shut the door and locked it with a key that was hung on a wall nail. She tiptoed back to her spot on the couch. Heart thudding, she remembered why she'd even set foot on the moor. This was all for Anton. She was going to prove she was worthy enough for him. Perhaps he'd see he needn't wait any longer and propose. Tucking her barely tasted loaf back in her coat pocket, she peered outside. Night had fallen. The gloomy and dark outside was now pure black against her window, so that she couldn't see if anything was out on the compound. Like Anton had told her, she shouldn't travel once it was nighttime. Come tomorrow early morning, and the brush was not found. She was to journey back immediately. Although the lads knew Anton longer than she, Lacy was still sure in her heart that if she entered town with a brush marked with a star or without, Anton would still be enamored of her, and 'twas this peaceful thought that prompted Lacy to get up and prepare the bed for the night. She placed the key on the desk and pulled back the covers and slipped inside, hand clutching the dagger. Now, despite all horrors and thoughts of them, incredibly, she was able to drift off into a stirring slumber, and then a deep one, and this would have continued had it not been for that small noise that stood out in the dreadful silence. A click. Lacy's eyes widened, and she dared not move an inch. Under the covers, she enclosed her hand around the dagger in her satchel and surveyed the possible cause with only her eyes. Eyes adjusted and looking around. Nothing seemed out of place, and she almost missed it as the room was too dark, but then she didn't. The door. It was open. Lacy's heart hammered inside her chest, and she murmured silent prayers as she slipped out the dagger and quietly stepped out of the bed. She glanced at the desk where she placed the key, and it was still there. Fierce was but a word if the one who exhibited it was no more. Anton would understand. She pressed against the door jamb and slid out of the bedroom, as quiet as could be, and shone her flashlight in the hallway. She was met with nothing. She pursed her lips and crept forward, wondering she had gone mad. Wouldn't one think they, too, had gone mad if they were in Lacy's shoes? Was it not one's mind playing tricks on them? Lacy's forehead broke out in a cold sweat. She would have to disobey Anton and travel by night. She turned around and gasped. In front of her stood a shadow. Its mouth was gaping and took half of its face, and in the place where eyes sat were black sunken holes. It reared its head back with insane speed and lowered it again, the eyeless holes now filled with demonic ones. Lacy fell to her knees, screaming, and rushed to the staircase on her fours. She dared not look back at that thing. Not paying any mind to injury, she threw herself down the staircase, landing with a thud. She didn't halt once before dashing to the doors of the manor, but didn't get to open it before she felt an icy, scaly hand grab her ankle. Lacy shrieked and clawed at the ground, her eyes shut tight, not wanting to turn around. It sank its nails into her flesh. Lacy screamed with tears pouring out of her eyes. The whistles of the train sounded as it passed them and left down the moor. When the last faint whistle was blown, the creature convulsed. Lacy's raw throat gave its last shriek as it lunged for her. And it just so happened that when Lacy was no more, the empty portrait on the staircase had a new face on it. Story 2. Title: Leave. Jessica woke because of the cold. Icy tendrils of damp were clawing at her arms, and the chattering of her teeth was enough to make her jaw ache. Beside her, Jackson slept soundly. The duvet was tucked around her shoulders, and his face was relaxed and innocently boyish. The cold that seemed to be seeping into her very bones didn't appear to be affecting him in the slightest. Jessica remembered her mother talking about fevers, so hot they tricked you into thinking that the burning you felt was ice. She certainly felt like she wasn't completely awake. The semi-dreamlike state was disorienting, and when a car went past and lit the room with its headlights, she could see mist curling around the corners of the bedroom. Jackson's house was fully insulated, and he'd talked about the cost of getting his windows double-glazed only last month. Granted, it was her first overnight stay here, but Jackson took pride in everything he had. The house would not let in fog. Jessica wished that she could wake up fully and move her arms. Her limbs felt like lead, the illness weighing them down. The bedside light was close, and the light would help her assess how sick she was. Maybe Jackson would even wake up and check her temperature for her. If only she could lift her hand to turn it on. Leave. The fever must be strong if she was hallucinating. The voice was faint enough that she knew she was imagining it. Leave. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, her fevered mind, unable to pinpoint the direction of the sound. Leave. Her heart was beating too quickly, a staccato rhythm at the base of her throat, and she wondered if she might need an ambulance. Leave. 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 Another car. Another fleeting brightening of the room. The paralysis broke, and Jessica's scream filled the room. Jackson woke up immediately, and his light was on before Jessica had finished the exhale. In the harsh light, Jessica's fever vanished like it had never been. Jackson was angry when she couldn't explain the scream, which she found hurtful. Surely he could give her a break? After she told him about the strange fever, and given his examinations of the goosebumps on her arms, he was mollified, but his shoulders turned away from her as he settled. Irritated that she disturbed his sleep for no good reason, she watched him fall asleep again, wishing that she could pacify him with a tale of a night terror or the glimpse of a mouse. But how could she explain the bloodied face of the woman and the broken, grasping fingers that had reached for her? She obsessed about it the next day and made an excuse to avoid returning that night. The woman's face was imprinted on her mind, and she replayed the moment again and again. The caved cheekbones, the shattered teeth, the torn fingernails. By the weekend, Jackson was getting annoyed with her avoidance. He had bought groceries to make her dinner, he complained, and they were going to go to waste without her. He wanted to know why she was skittish and suddenly had to work late. Was she seeing someone else? Didn't she love him anymore? She was his world. His everything. Was she abandoning him? He sounded so heartbroken that she gave in. After a few days of distance, the memory was losing its edge, and she knew that a bad dream, for what else could it have been, wasn't worth compromising her relationship for. She returned. They had a lovely evening. Jackson made pasta, and they drank wine on the porch, talking about work and families. There was a bit of tension when she mentioned spending time with a following weekend. Jackson had planned a trip to the theater, so Jessica canceled on Annie and everything was fine. She would have more fun with him anyway. None of her friends really understood her the way he did. He was so happy when she told him that she could go, that it more than made up for the sadness in her friend's voice. He was right, too. Annie was just jealous and being selfish. She was so lucky to have him. It took Jessica a long time to drift off. The slightest rustle of the curtain was enough to wake her from her shallow slumber. But eventually, she succumbed to the pull of unconsciousness. Leave. The voice startled her awake. Once again, her limbs were heavy, and she was trapped in the hell of her body. Leave? This time, the source of the noise was obvious. It was coming from the shadow in the corner. As Jessica watched, dumb with terror, the shadow moved. It scaled the walls with jerky movements. A passing car lit the room briefly, and Jessica caught a glimpse of a body, twisted and grotesque, climbing towards the ceiling. Its face was turned towards her, and she saw that it was the woman from before. Her arms were hanging oddly, perhaps broken, and she dragged herself up in fits and starts. Jessica's breath was quick and shallow. Her chest was the only part of her that was moving. Leave? The woman was almost directly above her. Leave. What had been the dry rustle of the wind through leaves in a graveyard was getting louder. Now, the scrape of ragged nails under a closed lid. Now, the frenzied cry of the forever trapped. L-E-A-V-E, Jackson swore as he woke, all flailing limbs and angry confusion. He thought she was the cause, and what could Jessica say? The dead woman screamed it. Not me. He wouldn't be calmed, either, and they ended up standing, Jackson fury personified and Jessica cowering before his wrath. The names he called her weren't fair, but who could blame him? As far as he was concerned, Jessica had waited till he was asleep and then shocked him awake with a jarring noise. What would the neighbors think? What kind of sick sense of humor did she have? At one point, he raised his hand and Jessica flinched. But he saw and caught himself, scooping her up in apologetic arms. He was sorry for that. She'd pushed him so far, but she didn't deserve that. They fell back asleep with limbs entangled, Jessica tightly ensconced in his embrace. And the woman did not return. They stayed at hers for a while. Jessica made an effort to make her apartment welcoming for him, enticing him over with favorite beers and lingerie and whispered promises. He enjoyed the attention, relished being treated like a king. Women have forgotten how to treat their men nowadays, he said as Jessica rubbed his shoulders and tried not to think of bloodied lips and exposed bone. It was nice to be with someone who understood how things should be. Jessica nodded and apologized again for the burnt steak at dinner. She didn't tell him it was because she'd looked for the time and thought she'd seen matted hair in the reflection in the glass on the clock. He forgave her, though, and she promised again to be more careful next time. She rubbed her wrist where he'd gripped it so tightly and reassured him again. She evaded his requests to go to his house for the next few weeks. What had been a treat for him had become routine, and he didn't understand why she wouldn't come to him. He had to drive 20 minutes out of his way to get to hers, but his house was only 10 minutes from where she worked. Was it too much to ask for her to put the effort? Eventually, he got tired of listening to her excuses and demanded it. He wasn't being unreasonable. Jackson saw her for who she was, loved her more deeply than anyone else could, and was the only one in the world who truly cared for her. She could get over her objections and give him something in return. So she went back. Every movement made her jump. The scraping of Jackson's chair as he stood up, a squeak. The chiming of the clock, a spilled coffee. The slam of the porch door, a wine glass shattered on the carpet. The storm arrived after that, though. Jessica was putting away the dishes after dinner when the drop of blood in the sink made her raise her head. The woman clung to the cabinets, and her face was inches from Jessica's own. She wore a sense of urgency, like a shawl. "Leave!" Jessica's screech made Jackson turn, and her outgoing arm caught him full in the face. Jackson's rage was to be expected, but the strength of it took her by surprise. She was clumsy and stupid. His lip was swelling, and it was her fault. She'd already ruined a new carpet with a wine that was already staining. Her reactions were ridiculous. Why was she so jumpy anyway? What was she hiding? Why would she hide something from him? Jessica's half-articulated attempts at pacifying him only made it worse. Why was she treating him like a child? He'd been so patient, so good, and this was how she repaid him? With deceit and patronizing excuses? As Jackson advanced, Jessica saw the shadow crouching in the hall. It flinched away from Jackson as he dragged Jessica towards it, shrinking as he shouted about how she was just like other women. She lied and manipulated. She tried to make a fool out of him. She was a conniving bitch. She saw the wide eyes of the woman, streaked with ruptured capillaries and horror, at the bottom of the basement stairs. No words, no pleas for forgiveness would soothe Jackson's ire. He was fury and vengeance and justice. Jessica saw the woman's expression, unmistakably sorrowful, as she wheeled through the air, desperately trying to catch a handhold to save herself. Jessica landed on the cold concrete of the basement, her own body now twisted in sympathy, her own face marred and bloodied to match. Her final breath was scented with the woman's fetid exhale, and the last thing she heard was the mournful whisper. "I tried to warn you."